So for over a century now, if you took a standard university course on Eastern philosophy, you'd probably be taught something very specific about one of India's oldest systems.
Right, you'd get the textbook version.
Exactly, the textbook version of Samkhya philosophy. And it's almost always presented as this uncompromisingly atheistic, cold, hyper-rational view of the universe.
Which is, frankly, a massive oversimplification.
It really is. I mean, they teach it as this system that leaves literally zero room for a creator god or any sort of divine will. It's just mechanics.
Right, like an ancient anomaly that somehow predicted modern materialism.
Yeah, exactly. But when you actually go back and read the historical texts, that whole narrative just completely falls apart. It's a total myth.
It really is one of the most fascinating cases of academic cherry-picking out there.
Which is exactly what our mission is today. We're taking a deep dive into the theological context of Samkhya philosophy.
The daivaśāstrīya sandarbha, to use the Sanskrit term.
Yes, the daivaśāstrīya sandarbha. And we're using Shankar Santhamurthy's recent, highly detailed academic analysis of the Indian knowledge system to really get into the weeds here. We're unpacking the source code.
Because we have this tendency, especially in the West, to want ancient thought to fit into very neat modern boxes, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Like it either has to be pure mystical faith.
Right, floating in the clouds.
Yeah. Or it has to look like early quantum physics, like a strict materialist deconstruction of reality.
And Samkhya routinely gets shoved into that second box because it is just so fiercely logical.
But its reputation as a purely atheistic system is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Right?
Completely. It's a misunderstanding of how the philosophy evolved over time. It didn't just emerge from the ancient world fully formed, frozen in amber.
I think that's the most crucial context for us to set up right at the start. We're talking about a philosophical school that basically had a multi-century theological identity crisis.
That's a great way to put it, actually. It really did.
The timeline shows it went through three very distinct phases.
Right, three distinct models.
It started out deeply theistic, then it transitioned into this really pragmatic, agnostic middle period.
And only much later did it crystallize into that hardline atheistic model.
Which is the one academics just fell in love with and popularized all over the globe.
Because it resonated so deeply with a 19th and 20th century Western worldview, they were desperately trying to separate rigorous logical inquiry from theology.
Right. But if you want to understand the history of human thought, or how concepts like spirit and nature interact, you have to understand the whole picture.
You really do. I mean, whether you're looking at modern psychology or later traditions like yoga and Vedanta, Samkhya is the foundation. It's the vocabulary for almost everything that comes after it in India.
Okay, well, let's unpack this vocabulary then. Because before we can even debate where God fits into this system, we have to establish the basic mechanics of reality here.
Right, the absolute ontological dualism.
Yes. There are two fundamental, irreducible building blocks to the entire cosmos in this system: Purusha and Prakriti.
These are the two pillars. So if we break them down, Prakriti is the material principle. It's nature.
In the broadest possible sense of the word, right?
Exactly. It includes the tangible, physical universe, everything you can touch or measure. But crucially, it also includes the unmanifest, latent potential for that universe.
So it's basically the primordial matrix of matter.
Yes. Essentially, it is everything in existence that is not inherently conscious.
And I think that's where a lot of people initially get tripped up.
Yeah.
Because Prakriti isn't just rocks and trees and stars.
No, not at all.
It encompasses the mind, the intellect, the ego, the entire psychological apparatus.
Which is a huge hurdle for Western thinkers.
Yeah.
Post-Descartes, we're so used to lumping mind and consciousness together on one side and physical matter on the other.
Right. But here, the intellect itself is just considered a subtler form of matter. It's still part of the machine.
That is a vital distinction. The mind is a highly refined instrument, but it is just an instrument. It computes, it reacts, but it doesn't possess independent awareness.
That independent awareness belongs entirely to the other pillar.
Exactly, Purusha.
Purusha is the sentient spirit. It's pure, unchanging consciousness.
With no physical dimensions, no attributes, and most importantly, it doesn't actually do anything.
It just sits there.
It is the eternal witness. It simply observes the churning machinery of Prakriti.
And the classical texts describe the relationship between these two, this completely inert observer and this hyperactive matrix of nature, as an abhadya viva.
Yes, an unbound wedlock.
I just find that phrasing so incredibly evocative. Unbound wedlock.
It perfectly captures the paradox, doesn't it? They are fundamentally opposite in nature.
One is active and unconscious, and the other is conscious but totally inactive.
Yet reality as we experience it is entirely dependent on them being locked in this cosmic marriage. Without Prakriti, Purusha has nothing to witness.
And without Purusha, Prakriti is just a blind, unobserved churning of matter.
Exactly.
I want to look closely at the etymology of the word Purusha, because the sources brought up this point from Adi Shankaracharya that grounds this abstract idea into something really mechanical.
Oh, the breakdown of the Sanskrit root. Yes, it's brilliant.
He explains that Purufa means a town or a walled city.
Which represents the physical body and the cognitive apparatus.
Right. So Purusha literally translates to the resident of that city, one who dwells within the town.
It's a perfect linguistic encapsulation. The body, the senses, the intellect, that whole apparatus is the city of Prakriti. It has architecture and infrastructure.
But consciousness, Purusha, is the silent resident just looking out through the windows of the senses.
Right.
I was thinking about this, and it's basically like building a state-of-the-art smart home.
A smart home. I like that. Walk me through it.
Well, the house itself is Prakriti. You can wire it with the most advanced sensors, automated climate control, motion lights, security systems.
It has a massive, complex potential to function.
Exactly. The hardware and software are perfectly integrated. But if the house is sitting empty, it doesn't actually mean anything. It's just dormant circuitry and drywall.
Right. The environmental sensors only trigger when someone is there.
Yeah, the lights only come on. The architecture only fulfills its purpose when the resident, the Purusha, walks through the front door. The house provides the mechanics, but the resident provides the witnessing awareness.
That analogy holds up incredibly well, especially when you consider sensory feedback loops.
How so?
Well, the smart home sensors are constantly taking in data, much like our physical senses, but the house itself doesn't experience the temperature dropping?
Right, it just registers a data point and executes a reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's only the resident inside who actually feels cold.
But that brings up the friction point, right? How does that interaction actually begin?
Yes, the initial boot-up sequence.
Right, we have the silent resident and we have the highly complex smart home. What initiates that moment where the unmanifest potential of Prakriti suddenly starts evolving into the manifest universe?
That is the multi-million-dollar philosophical question. Who or what introduced them?
Was there a matchmaker for this unbound wedlock?
Did an architect design the smart home specifically for the resident? How different thinkers across history answered that specific question is exactly how we chart the three distinct historical eras of Samkhya.
Okay, let's get into those eras, because this is where the myth really gets busted.
We have to begin with the earliest era, the foundational framework. This is referred to as Sefer Samkhya, or the theistic model.
And we find this deeply embedded in early texts like the philosophical sections of the Mahabharata and the Mahapuranas.
Right. In this original conceptualization, the existence of a supreme god, referred to as Ishwara or Maheshwara, isn't just accepted, it's structurally necessary for the system to work.
Because in this model, God provides the initial impulse.
Exactly. Purusha and Prakriti are eternal, but left to their own devices, they are at a total standstill.
So Ishwara is the efficient cause, the catalyst that triggers Prakriti to begin its evolutionary process.
To really understand how God acts as that catalyst, we have to look at a critical concept called saṃkhyadarśanasya.
Oh, right, the underlying theory of causality. I wanted to ask about this because it operates on a fundamentally different logic than what a lot of listeners might be used to.
It's an explicit rejection of creation ex nihilo, the idea that God just snaps his fingers and conjures the universe out of absolute nothingness.
Right, because Samkhya logic argues that you literally cannot get something from nothing.
Entirely. If the universe exists now, its material substance must have always existed in some form.
The sources used a really great analogy here. If you want to press oil, you have to start with sesame seeds.
Because the oil is already latent within the seed. You cannot press oil out of sand.
So everything that currently exists and everything that will ever exist is already folded up and dormant within the unmanifest state of Prakriti.
Yes. So in this early theistic model, God isn't inventing matter out of thin air.
God is providing the divine will, the Ishwara Sankalpa.
It's almost like God's will is the thermodynamic energy required to cause that cosmic seed of Prakriti to finally sprout.
Right, to unfold its latent geometry into the manifest universe. So the material cause is Prakriti, but the efficient cause, the trigger, is Ishwara.
That is a highly precise way to look at it. It's logically tight, it integrates beautifully with ancient Indian religious culture, and it gives a clear mechanism for the start of cosmic time.
But then, as we move forward in history, we see a pretty dramatic shift in how scholars engaged with these concepts.
We do. We move into the intermediate or hybrid period, and this is where things get philosophically messy in the best way possible.
We see this documented in texts like the Charaka Samhita, right?
Yes, which
Yeah.
is one of the most important foundational treatises on Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine.
So what's the shift here?
It's profound. These texts adopt the entire dualistic framework. They use Purusha and Prakriti. They map out the evolutes of mind and body, but they completely drop the concept of Ishwara.
So they just become atheists.
No, not necessarily. God isn't denied. God just becomes utterly irrelevant to the discourse. The philosophy becomes functionally agnostic.
You know, I look at this shift and I really wonder, is this actually a crisis of faith? Or is it just a harsh pivot toward pragmatic utility?
What do you mean?
Well, if you're writing the Charaka Samhita, you are writing a medical textbook. You are trying to figure out how the physical elements of Prakriti interact with biology to cure a disease.
Right, your focus is entirely clinical.
Exactly. It feels very similar to modern specialized science.
Yeah.
You could have a brilliant neurosurgeon who is deeply devout in their personal life, but when they are charting electrical impulses in the brain, they don't use divine will as a variable in their equations.
No, of course not. God is simply not useful for the specific mechanical problem they are trying to solve.
So is that what's happening here?
I agree completely. It's methodological naturalism. These scholars were obsessed with the granular mechanical realities of the human system.
If your goal is to balance the physical energies of a sick patient, the metaphysical question of who triggered the universe a billion years ago has zero clinical value.
Exactly. You just need to know how the smart home is wired right now. So they bracketed the theology out of the conversation entirely.
But it seems like by doing that, by removing God for pragmatic reasons, they inadvertently built the scaffolding for the next generation to remove God entirely for logical reasons.
Yes, that pragmatic middle period leads directly into the third era, the classical period, or Nirishvara Samkhya.
The atheistic model.
Yes. This is the era of classical treatises like the Samkhya Karika and the Samkhya Prabhatana Sutra.
And in this phase, the system hardens.
It moves from merely ignoring God to explicitly arguing against the necessity of God's existence.
But wait, if they throw out Ishwara Sankalpa, if there's no divine will to trigger that unmanifest seed into action, how do they explain the start of the evolutionary process?
How does the unbound wedlock begin without a matchmaker?
Right, because Prakriti is inert on its own.
They replaced divine intervention with a theory of catalytic proximity.
Catalytic proximity.
Yes. They argue that the sheer presence of Purusha near Prakriti is enough to disturb its dormant equilibrium.
The texts rely heavily on a specific analogy here, don't they?
Yeah.
The magnet and the iron.
The lodestone, exactly.
So if you place a powerful magnet on a table and you scatter iron shavings around it, the magnet doesn't possess will.
No, it doesn't make a conscious decision to attract the iron. It just sits there, completely inert.
Yet its mere proximity causes the iron shavings to violently align and organize themselves into a complex magnetic field.
The action happens entirely within the iron, but it is completely dependent on the presence of the magnet.
That is such a brilliant analogy.
It is. In classical Samkhya, pure consciousness is the magnet. Nature, Prakriti, is the iron.
So the sheer radiant proximity of eternal consciousness is so powerful that just being near it causes nature to lose its equilibrium.
Prakriti begins to dance, to evolve, to spin out the intellect, the ego, the physical elements. It's an automatic, blind, mechanical process initiated entirely by presence, not by will.
It's incredibly elegant. You can immediately see why 19th century Western philosophers who are operating at the height of scientific materialism latched onto this specific iteration.
Oh, it was the perfect text for the zeitgeist of that era. It gave them an ancient, highly sophisticated Eastern system that mirrored their own attempts to explain the universe without a creator deity.
But in elevating that specific atheistic model as the definitive Samkhya, Western academia basically erased the theistic origins from the mainstream narrative.
They did. Which brings us back to our primary mission today, digging up the receipts.
Yes. Let's look at the actual source code. We've established that the foundational model was theistic, but how exactly did those ancient texts describe this supreme being.
And crucially, what were the mechanics for a human soul trying to escape this endless grinding cycle of material existence?
Right. How do you get out of the smart home?
To find those answers, we have to look closely at the Mahabharata. Specifically, a massive philosophical section known as the Shanti Parva.
Which deals extensively with ethics, statecraft, and moksha liberation.
Exactly. And within the Shanti Parva, there are numerous highly technical philosophical dialogues, or savada.
The sources point specifically to the dialogues between the sage Vasista and King Karalajanaka, and another famous exchange between sage Yadnavalkya and King Janaka.
In these dialogues, the theological framework is completely explicit. The highest principle is not just an abstract catalytic presence like a magnet.
It is explicitly identified as the supreme deity, usually conceptualized as Mahavishnu or Narayana.
And perhaps the most undeniable piece of textual evidence comes from a text embedded within the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, wow, yes. If we look at chapter 11, verse 38, we find a dialogue that basically collapses the entire atheistic argument.
This is the moment where the warrior Arjuna is speaking to Sri Krishna, having just been shown Krishna's terrifying, cosmic, universal form.
And the Sanskrit language Arjuna uses here is dense with Samkhya terminology, but it's repurposed for a theistic climax.
He addresses Krishna as the primal deity, the ancient Purusha. He calls him the supreme resting place of the universe.
But the philosophical crux is when he identifies God as both the knower and the object of knowledge.
Right. And if we pull from Adi Shankaracharya's commentary on this specific verse, the implications are just staggering.
Shankaracharya points out that in this theistic vision, God isn't merely sitting outside the machine pushing a button.
No. God is the ultimate subject who perceives, God is the ultimate object that is perceived, and God is the very cognitive process of knowing itself.
So the duality of Purusha and Prakriti is somehow encompassed within this singular supreme divinity.
And that concept of the supreme resting place is deeply tied to Samkhya cosmology regarding time.
Because time in these systems is cyclical, not linear.
Right, you have periods of cosmic manifestation and periods of total dissolution known as the pralaya kala.
So at the end of a cosmic cycle, the universe doesn't just pop out of existence.
Remember Satkarivada? It has to go somewhere.
Right. The entire manifest universe folds back in on itself. It regresses back into unmanifest potential.
But in the theistic model, it doesn't just sit there in the dark as an unmanifest blob.
Yeah.
It withdraws itself directly back into the supreme divinity.
The universe is breathed out by God. It exists for an eon. And then it is inhaled back into the supreme resort.
Exactly. So that establishes the macro-level cosmology. The universe is a breathing organism anchored in God.
But these philosophies are rarely just interested in the macro. They want to explain the predicament of the individual soul.
The Jivatma.
The Jivatma, which is currently trapped inside the smart home and desperately trying to figure out how to unlock the front door.
To understand the mechanics of that trap, we look to the teachings of the sage Kapila, found in the Bhagavata Purana.
Kapila delivers a profound discourse to his mother, Devahuti. Right?
Yes. He explains exactly how pure consciousness becomes entangled in matter. And he does this by breaking down the internal operating system of Prakriti, which is governed by the Trigunas.
The Trigunas, the three modes of material nature, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas.
Prakriti is not a monolithic substance. It's a braid of these three dynamic qualities.
Let's break those down.
Sure. Sattva represents illumination, goodness, equilibrium, and knowledge.
Okay.
Rajas is kinetic energy, passion, action, and desire.
And Tamas.
Tamas is inertia, ignorance, darkness, and lethargy.
So every single thing in the physical and psychological universe is made up of some fluctuating combination of these three modes.
Everything. And according to Kapila, the tragedy of the human condition is a crisis of mistaken identity driven by these gunas.
The individual Purusha, which is inherently free and pure, gets totally hypnotized by the complex, constantly shifting dance of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas.
It gets so absorbed in the movie playing on the screen that it forgets it is sitting in the theater.
Wow, yes. And the texts identify the exact psychological mechanisms that lock this hypnosis into place. The root of all human suffering comes down to two specific cognitive errors:
Ahankara and Mamakara.
Let's unpack the mechanics of those errors, because they are so relevant to daily life.
Well, ahankara is typically translated as the ego, but literally it means the I maker.
The false identification of the physical body and the mind as the self.
Right. It's the moment the resident of the smart home actually begins to believe that they are the drywall and the wiring.
And once you believe you are the walls of the house, You become terrified of the walls being damaged.
Exactly. Which leads directly to mamakara, which is possessiveness, or the concept of mine.
Wow.
My house, my body, my family, my social status.
My political opinion?
Yes. Mamakara is the psychological grasping that results from ahankara.
The sources use a really visceral example here, road rage.
Ah, yes. If you cut someone off in traffic and they experience sudden, blinding flash of rage, what is mechanically happening in the Samkhya framework?
Their ahankara, their false identification with their car, and their physical safety feels threatened.
And their mamakara fiercely defends its right to possess the space on the road. They are completely at the mercy of rajas, the mode of passionate action.
So long as you are operating under the delusion of I and mine, you are shackled to the trigunas.
You are trapped in the unbound wedlock.
So the ultimate question becomes, how do you get out? How do you sever the connection?
And this is where we see the starkest, most consequential difference between the atheistic model and the original theistic model.
The methodology for liberation, or moksha, completely changes.
Entirely. In the classical atheistic model, liberation is a purely cognitive, intellectual achievement.
Because the bondage was caused by a lack of discrimination, you confuse the magnet with the iron.
Therefore, to get free, you must engage in rigorous meditation and intellectual analysis to achieve perfect discriminative knowledge.
You essentially have to realize, with absolute unshakable certainty, I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am pure consciousness.
And the theory is, once you truly achieve that cognitive realization, the magnet is effectively removed. Nature stops dancing for you, the gunas lose their grip, and you achieve isolation and freedom.
So it's an inside job. You save yourself through your own intellect.
But in the theistic model taught by Kapila, the methodology is radically different.
Kapila explicitly states that the individual soul is deeply conditioned. The impurities of lust, greed, and the habits of ahankara cannot be scoured away by intellectual gymnastics alone.
Because the intellect is part of prakriti. Trying to use the intellect to escape prakriti is like trying to lift yourself up by your own shoelaces.
You need an outside force.
Exactly. You require divine grace. The individual Purusha is fundamentally dependent on the supreme Purusha.
So the mechanism for escaping the trap is not just cold, detached analysis. It is bhakti devotional service.
You have to surrender your false ego to the supreme consciousness.
Going back to our analogy, if the smart home malfunctions and locks the doors, the atheistic model says you just sit in the hallway, study the blueprints, and reverse engineer the lock yourself.
Right, but the theistic model says the lock is too complex for you to pick from the inside.
You need to call the architect who built the house, surrender your pride, and ask them to open the door for you.
That shift from cognitive self-reliance to devotional surrender changes the entire emotional and philosophical tenor of the system.
It really does. And it's precisely this theistic, grace-based version of the Purusha Prakriti dynamic that rippled outward and became the foundational operating system for the later theological movements in India.
Which is a perfect segue into how this ancient source code was adapted.
Samkhya did not exist in a vacuum. Its core vocabulary, the duality of spirit and matter, was so logically robust that the later Vedanta schools essentially pirated the software.
They used it to build their own massive theological empires.
Let's talk about Vedanta.
Vedanta literally translates to the end of the Vedas, meaning these schools were primarily focused on interpreting the philosophical teachings of the Upanishads.
But as they tried to construct cohesive models of reality, they realized they couldn't ignore the sheer explanatory power of Samkhya's physics.
So they imported Purusha and Prakriti, but they applied heavy software patches to force the dualism to fit their specific theological goals.
Let's look at how the three major heavyweights of Vedanta applied those software patches, starting with Advaita Vedanta, institutionalized by Adi Shankaracharya.
Advaita means non-dualism, so right out of the gate you have a massive structural conflict.
How does a non-dualistic school use a strictly dualistic framework like Samkhya?
Shankaracharya solved this by creating a highly sophisticated, two-tiered epistemology of reality.
Two-tiered reality.
He argued that from the perspective of our day-to-day empirical experience, what he called the Vyavaharika Sata reality looks exactly like theistic Samkhya.
So you perceive yourself as an individual soul, a Jivama, interacting with a very real material world, the Jagat or Prakriti.
And you acknowledge that this whole system is governed by a supreme collective consciousness, Ishvara.
So on Tuesday afternoon, when you were walking to the market, the dualism is functionally real. You are the subject, the market is the object.
Yes. But Shankaracharya argues that this is merely transactional reality. It is not the ultimate truth.
What happens when you achieve ultimate realization?
In the paramarthika state, that entire structure of separation collapses. You realize that the division between the soul, the world, and God was a perceptual error caused by Maya.
Now, Maya is often lazily translated as illusion, which makes people think the world is just a hallucination or a matrix simulation.
It's much more precise than that. The texts use the term mityatva.
Mityatva, let's break that down.
It does not mean the world is completely fake, like a mirage of water in a desert that has no substance whatsoever.
Right.
It means that the world has a dependent, temporary reality, but our perception of it as something entirely separate from the ultimate consciousness is false.
So in absolute reality, the individual soul is the supreme soul. Jivatma is Brahman.
There's only one singular, infinite entity. So Advaita uses Samkhya's dualism to explain the mechanics of the illusion, but discards the dualism completely at the ultimate level of truth.
And one of the most interesting aspects of Shankaracharya's patch is that it is entirely non-sectarian.
Yes, because the ultimate reality is formless, abstract Brahman.
The specific face you put on the transactional Ishvara doesn't strictly matter. You can conceptualize God as Shiva or Vishnu or the goddess.
They are all just different user interfaces for the same underlying formless code.
But not all Vedanta schools were okay with that kind of theological fluidity, were they?
No, definitely not. Which brings us to the second major school. Vishishtadvaita, the school of qualified non-dualism, championed by Ramanuja.
Ramanuja aggressively rejected Shankaracharya's idea that the separation of souls and matter was just an illusion.
He was a strict monotheist, and for him, the supreme God was explicitly and exclusively Mahavishnu.
So if the world isn't an illusion, how does Ramanuja handle the Samkhya duality? How does he connect a pure God to impure matter without compromising God's perfection?
Ramanuja accepts the fundamental building blocks, but he renames them to emphasize their attributes. Purusha becomes Chit, representing the sentient, conscious principle.
And Prakriti becomes Achit, the insentient material principle.
To connect them to God, he relies on a theory of inseparable attributes, using two primary analogies.
The texts point to the Anga-Angi relationship and the Sharira-Shariri relationship.
The Anga-Angi relationship is a part and whole dynamic. The individual souls and matter are real, distinct parts that make up the unified whole of God.
But the Sharira-Shariri analogy is far more profound, I think. It translates to a body and soul relationship.
Meaning the universe is the physical body of God.
Wow.
It's a breathtaking, nested hierarchy. According to Ramanuja, God Mahavishnu is the innermost soul, the absolute center of all existence.
And this supreme soul is intimately wrapped by the individual souls, the Jivatmas.
Yes. The individual souls are essentially the body of God. But then those individual souls are in turn wrapped by the insentient material universe, the Sharia or Akit.
So the material world is the body for the individual soul, and the collective of individual souls is a body for God.
They are distinct entities, but they are absolutely inseparable, much like the blueness of a lotus cannot be separated from the lotus itself.
It is just a stunning architectural model of reality. God isn't aloof from matter. Matter is literally the outer garment of divinity.
But then we have the third major competitor in the Vedanta arena, which takes an entirely different approach, Dvaita, established by Madhvacharya.
Madhvacharya looked at both Shankara and Ramanuja and fundamentally disagreed with any attempts to blur the lines.
Dvaita is a fierce, uncompromising dualism. Madhva leans completely into the differences.
In Madhva's system, the individual soul is a completely dependent, subordinate principle. It is eternally distinct from and utterly reliant on Mahavishnu.
And his view of Prakriti is incredibly stark. He views it as Jadatva, absolute, lifeless, inert matter.
There is no nested body-soul intimacy, and there is certainly no illusion of oneness.
The gap between the infinite creator and the finite created is real, massive, and eternal.
Yet look at the common thread running through all three of these incredibly complex theological systems.
Right. Whether Shankara is arguing for illusion, Ramanuja is arguing for a nested hierarchy, or Madhva is arguing for absolute dependency.
They're all utilizing the exact same foundational vocabulary. The fingerprints of Samkhya's Purusha and Prakriti are embedded in every single argument.
But this raises a massive structural question. We've seen how these philosophies applied different logical patches.
But why did they arrive at such drastically different conclusions?
If Shankara, Ramanuja, and Madhva are all brilliant scholars, all living in relatively similar cultural contexts. Why does one see the universe as an illusion while another sees it as the literal body of God?
To understand the root cause of that divergence, we have to move from ontology to epistemology. We have to look at what constitutes valid knowledge.
It all comes down to exactly which ancient texts these philosophers accepted as the ultimate unassailable authority.
Because the historical texts of India are not a single monolithic book. They are vast, sprawling libraries.
And broadly speaking, they are divided into two massive parallel streams of scripture.
On one side, we have the Vedic corpus. On the other side, we have the Agamas.
And understanding the difference between these two is the master key to unlocking why Indian philosophy looks the way it does.
Okay, let's trace the architecture of these texts. The Vedic corpus is the older stream, right?
Yes, it consists of the four Vedas, Rig, Sama, Yajur, and Atharva. But horizontally, these texts are sliced into four distinct layers of complexity.
You have the Samhitas, which are the core mantras and hymns.
Then the Brahmanas, which are dense manuals for conducting complex fire rituals.
The Aranyakas, the forest treatises that begin to internalize those rituals into meditation.
And finally, you reach the apex, the Upanishads, which contain the highly abstract philosophical core of the tradition.
So that is stream number one. Now, running parallel to the Vedas, you have the Agamas.
The Agamas are massive manuals deeply focused on temple worship, personal devotion, deity installation, and cosmology.
And they were generally divided into three main sectarian branches. Shaiva Agamas focused on Shiva, Vaishnava Agamas focused on Vishnu, and Shakta Agamas focused on the goddess.
Here is where the epistemological divergence dictates the theology.
Advaita Vedanta, Shankaracharya's school, relies almost exclusively on the final portion of the Vedic corpus, the Upanishads.
And the Upanishads are primarily concerned with exploring an abstract, formless, infinite reality, Brahman.
Crucially, Advaita does not elevate the sectarian agamas to the same level of absolute authority.
Exactly. Because Shankaracharya bases his entire system on texts that prioritize a formless absolute, his theology is forced to conclude that any specific form of God is ultimately secondary to the formless truth.
The text dictates the reality.
But the Vaishnava schools, Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita and Madhvacharya's Dvaita, make a radically different epistemological choice.
They explicitly integrate both the Vedic corpus and the Vaishnava agamas, treating them as equally authoritative.
And what happens when you elevate the Vaishnava agamas to the level of absolute truth? The entire texture of the universe changes.
Because the agamas don't just talk about abstract consciousness, they are deeply concerned with a personal, active, intervening God.
It is specifically the Vaishnava agamas, working in tandem with texts like the Mahapuranas, that fully develop the theology of the avatars, the divine incarnations.
The agamas explicitly detail how the supreme, infinite reality mathematically structures itself to descend into the finite world.
They outline the transcendent forms of God, the emanations, and crucially, the Vibhava avatars, which include the famous 10 avatars of Vishnu, the Dashavatara.
Like Rama and Krishna, stepping directly onto the stage of human history.
I think this is one of the most profound realizations you can have when studying the history of ideas.
The books you choose to hold as authoritative literally dictate the shape, the personality, and the mechanics of the God you believe in.
Because Ramanuja and Madhva accept the authority of the agamas, they cannot look at the universe and see an impersonal, formless consciousness playing hide-and-seek.
The texts demand that they see a deeply personal God who loves humanity enough to actively incarnate into history to save it.
They see a God of active grace.
And because their foundational texts demand a God of grace, their methodology for salvation has to change.
The cold, cognitive intellectualism of the atheistic Samkhya model is no longer sufficient.
If God is a person who loves you, salvation is not about figuring out a puzzle. It is about repairing a relationship.
The theology of the text dictates the methodology of the practitioner. You must rely on bhakti, devotion, to heal the rift caused by ahankara and mamakara.
Let's pull all of these threads together because we have covered a massive amount of philosophical ground today.
We really have. We started this deep dive with a mission to bust a pervasive academic myth.
We showed that Samkhya is not the inherently atheistic, sterile machine that textbook summaries often claim it is.
It's a living, breathing, evolving tradition. We traced its timeline from the early theistic model, where the divine will of Ishwara acts as the catalyst,
Through the pragmatic hybrid era of the medical text that focused purely on biology.
And finally, to the classical atheistic model, where the mere radiant proximity of spirit and matter sparks the universe into existence.
We looked at the mechanics of the unbound wedlock, the silent resident of Purusha, trapped inside the wildly complex smart home of Prakriti.
We saw how that foundational duality became the operating system for the greatest minds of India.
Shankara used it to explain the illusion of separation, Ramanuja used it to describe the universe as the literal body of God, and Madhva used it to define an absolute dependency on the divine.
But the most crucial takeaway from this exploration of the daivaśāstrīya sandarbha is that these aren't merely ancient historical debates.
No, these philosophers were attempting to map the exact contours of the human experience. The concepts they codified are actively operating in your mind right now.
Precisely. When you feel a surge of possessiveness, when you fiercely defend your opinions, your status, or your physical space.
When you are trapped by what is mine, you're experiencing the direct mechanical effects of ahankara and mamakara.
You are the pure, silent resident who has become entirely hypnotized by the blinking lights and alarms of the smart home.
You are experiencing the tragedy of Kapila's warning to his mother, playing out thousands of years later.
And how you choose to wake up from that hypnosis, whether through intense cognitive discrimination or through humble surrender to a grace greater than your own intellect, depends entirely on which map of reality you ultimately choose to trust.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought to explore. We spent a lot of time contrasting the theistic models with the classical atheistic model of Samkhya.
The model that argues there is no divine will, no grand architect.
Right. There is only pure consciousness and raw matter, and the universe bursts into existence simply because they are near each other, just like iron shavings reacting to the silent presence of a magnet.
It is a conceptually staggering proposition.
So the question I want to leave you with is this. If that atheistic model is true, if there is no God deliberately pushing the buttons of creation and nature just mechanically dances because consciousness happens to be nearby, does that make the universe a cold, lifeless, mechanical void? Or does the fact that raw, dead matter can be awakened into the staggering complexity of life, emotion, and intellect simply by the quiet, motionless presence of the soul make the sheer existence of consciousness itself the ultimate unexplainable miracle? It is something to seriously think about the next time you pause, take a breath, and simply notice the world happening around you.